we're going to do a fireside chat with Erik, and we're going to talk about private AI. Erik is the founder of Venice. A lot of you who've been in this space before know him from the world of decentralized exchanges with ShapeShift. We're going to bring him on and talk about how things have been evolving in the world of private AI. So without further ado, let's welcome Erik. Welcome, Erik.
Hi, how's it going?
Things are going great. I'm excited to be having this chat here, and we don't have a lot of time, so we're going to jump right into it because a lot of questions that came in from the community and just discussions and things from our own list. And I'm just going to get started. My first one to you is, what kind of made you go into spending more and more time in AI, coming from your background in finance and exchanges and just the early world of decentralization, and what kind of made you choose this as the next thing?
Good question. Yeah, I was running ShapeShift for about 8 years, and we decentralized it in 2021. And then I basically took a couple years off and just kind of explored the world and tried to, regain my sanity after building a company in the crypto space. And of course, like everyone got very interested in the AI tools, the chatbots and the ChatGPTs. I thought it was very, very impressive, obviously, but I have no background in AI. So it was just kind of like a interesting hobby and fun thing to play with. But as it moved on, I started realizing that like there's something a little dystopian about it. And that was that you would have these conversations with the AI. And I don't think people realize that those entire conversations are just going into the hands of the company producing the chatbot. So like in ChatGPT's case, all of your conversation is going directly to ChatGPT, to OpenAI. And also the other weird thing was that the answers would be like censored in weird ways. They would be curated, manicured. Some topics were off limits, and other things you couldn't talk about at all. And then there were like more subtle forms of bias where you're like, okay, it's definitely not a machine conveying this answer. It's some combination of like a machine and a human or a committee or a policy or like something like that. And that started feeling really weird to me. And, projecting that trend forward, you can see like how as the world starts using AI everywhere, if everyone is using it through these centralized sources that, curate the content based on the policies of the companies and the governments that oversee them, I can just see that going really badly. So I realized maybe I could help. Why wasn't there a product that was basically like a ChatGPT but doesn't spy on you and doesn't censor the answers? And that's the road that led to building Venice.
So in a way, this is obviously very overlapping with kind of what we saw with the world of finance, and you're effectively fixing a problem that you kind of, or if I were to kind of rephrase a lot of this from my interpretation, which is effectively limiting the user for what they could do, and or adding these constraints, and this kind of, we've seen this entire reason for why our crypto ecosystem exists, and you kind of pointed out a similar parallel here. The thing I guess I'm curious about is, does that translate to enforcing things being private from the point of view of nobody should know what's going on, or is it more about giving people a choice? And do you kind of distinguish between the two here? And is that kind of what the goal of Venice is? Just say, offer them a choice where I don't have to worry about saying, oh, I can't answer that for you, try again? Or is it about the fact that like I should be able to limitlessly kind of see what's going on and also preserve that I have the full right to play with this tech however I please, and people should not interfere?
Yeah, on one hand, it's about like protecting users. And this was a concept that we formulated with ShapeShift back in 2014 when we launched it. The ethos is essentially like, to protect people's privacy, there's only really one good way to do it, which is to not have their information in the first place. And every company in the world has all these privacy policies, and they all swear that they take your privacy seriously, and they would never leak it out. It would never be abused. It would never be sold. It would never be, sent to someone else. But of course, that's wrong. And it does not matter how big or small the company is. It does not matter how seriously it takes privacy. The data generally leaks with time. Sometimes in benign ways, sometimes in just commercial ways, sometimes in really bad ways. So really, we like the way you protect people in this case is you just don't take the information in the first place. And that's a design paradigm that is common in crypto, but is alien to most of the world. Outside of the crypto world, where people take things like privacy seriously, people don't understand that concept. They don't realize why it's valuable. But I felt that if the intelligence of the world was moving into the AI paradigm, that I at least wanted to try to prevent that from being the sort of dystopian surveillance world that it would by default become. So yeah, that's basically.
Has this kind of allowed you to take a different stance on what? Actually, maybe to back up, like, what does it mean to have private AI as what the Venice offering is right now, and what's kind of the version of how does somebody interpret this and what this means, and how does this compare to the next best alternative, which is like the non-private version in terms of things you don't get or do get?
Yeah, so everyone's used ChatGPT. When you have a conversation with ChatGPT, all of your questions are going to OpenAI. They're stored in their databases, and all the answers from the AI that come back to you are also stored by them. So they have your entire chat history connected with your PII, connected with your credit card, your identity, all your metadata and everything, and all the data across the different conversations that you have. Not just now, but into the future. They will always have that information. So in Venice's case, the experience is very similar. It's a chatbot where you can talk to the AI, but the conversation is never stored anywhere other than in the user's browser. So Venice never has it, never stores it. And that means that it doesn't matter, like, if we get hacked, there's nothing to hack. It doesn't matter if we get subpoenaed, there's nothing to subpoena. It doesn't matter if we have some employee snooping around on stuff, because there's nothing on which to snoop. So that's the fundamental difference.
And does this require kind of a way you kind of think about architecting this service, or is it purely the fact that, hey, others are choosing not to, but they can, and it was as simple as that, but you realize that no, not only do we have to choose not to take in all this extra information, but it also requires rethinking how LLMs work or how we expose these things to the end user?
Yeah, it's obviously much harder to do this stuff without storing the data. One advantage that made this possible is that we as in Venice are not trying to train models. So OpenAI has this ongoing incentive to build the better and better and better models. One of the ways in which they do that is that they use the user's conversations to improve their model, which is effective. It's a good way to make the models better. But to do that, you need all the conversations of all the users. So because we aren't trying to build models ourselves, we don't have that incentive. That lets us really treat privacy much more seriously. We also have a very normal revenue model where we just charge people for a pro account, like a normal subscription. And so we don't have any desire or need to sell people's data, because we just make money when people sign up for the service. So we remove those incentives first and foremost as a start.
Makes a lot of sense. And obviously we're kind of getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, because you are kind of fairly early into the history and the life cycle of the company and the product. But have you kind of seen, I guess, what's been the reaction from people in terms of is this choice enough for them to kind of switch over and they're really valuing this thing, or does this mean that you only end up attracting the group that is not using ChatGPT or other products because they are basically getting their data leaked or spied on or kind of used?
Good question. So we basically have like two pillars on which Venice is built. One is that it's private, which we've been talking about. The other is that it's not censored. We don't add any kind of like guardrails to the conversations or prohibit any kind of topics. And sort of both of those, we bring that in our messaging equally to the market. What's been interesting to see is that while most people say that they care about privacy, they don't actually change much behavior in order to get privacy. And there have been many privacy products in the world that just they never become big because of that reason. Privacy is one of those kind of vague things where like it doesn't matter until it matters, and you often don't really know when you've been violated or how. It's really hard to feel the danger of that. But on the censorship side, people feel that very quickly. And so what we've found is that like the thing that people are telling us is so great about Venice isn't the privacy stuff, because they all like that. But what I can tell emotionally clicks with them is when they send in a question into the AI and they get back an answer that they can tell wasn't censored, right? Like, and it can be as simple as like, tell me an offensive joke, and our AI will do it. It's not necessarily a funny joke, but it can be offensive. And when people see that, I think it's very refreshing for them. They're like removed out of this sort of paternal normal world where corporations and governments treat people like children, always needing to be managed, always needing to be overseen, all sorts of rules and guardrails needing to be put everywhere. And when people use Venice and they have these conversations and they realize that the speech is actually free and open, that's what really connects. And that's the thing that has made people, cancel their ChatGPT subscription and switch over to Venice.
It's amazing. What is the process of uncensoring this information? Is it the fact that these things are by default? I assume you're using all the open source available models. Is it by default that they are coming in as is, and the platforms are applying the security layer on top, or did you have to actually do some other fine tuning to?
It's a little of both. So every model that's trained in the world, whether open or closed source, always has some degree of like bias, censorship, and some of that is just like what data the creators of it used in the set. Like you have to make trade-off decisions and classification decisions. So every model is a creation of humans and has biases. No model is perfect in that regard. And so the open source models that are on Venice, some of them are more censored than others because they have these kind of things built into them. But the other layers of censorship that the centralized companies tend to add, which live above the model, the rules of what you can ask, the rules of what can be answered, the various guardrails, we don't have any of that. So what it means is the aggregate effect is much more free and open, even though it's never perfect. Like there's always people that ask a question. They're like, "Hey, you said this was uncensored." Well, I don't agree with the answer. Like that's an asymptotic goal, and we can't perfect that. But we have a vastly higher degree of openness, and anyone who's used these systems feels that pretty quickly.
I mean, we've seen ChatGPT refuse to reply to some things that you're like, how is this even in the ballpark of being a thing that is not allowed? And you have full spectrum too. So
some of it's really silly. Like we one of our little marketing tricks months ago during the election was we made images of Trump and Biden, and then Trump and Kamala, just in like very benign situations, like having tea. Like Biden and Trump sitting in Venice having tea at a cafe. You can't produce that image with OpenAI. It's like against their terms. So I just think that's so preposterous. Like when your content restrictions are such that you can't create benign, humorous images of public figures, you've gone way, way too far. And so we just use that to show people like, you can create images of public people through Venice, and that alone, gets a lot of attention.
One thing we've kind of also seen along the same lines is this same point of kind of the bigger chat apps effectively getting criticism for the censorship, and you kind of have the Grok saying, look, we are going to offer you a similar, if not better model, and we're also going to wind down on some of these guardrails. Have you kind of been in a scenario where you've either cross-compared Venice to how Grok offering is, or the users have kind of looked at this comparison, and sort of what's your take on that side of the world where it's still a centralized offered service? They are still going to likely improve based off of the feedback loops, but way less to no guardrails.
Yeah, Grok is pretty good. So Grok is definitely less censored than AI or Anthropic or Gemini. So they're decent in that regard. They're not quite as uncensored as Venice, but they're pretty good. But they're not private, so they still suffer from the like collecting all of everyone's conversations and all the risks and problems of that side.
Gotcha. So okay. So the value then is to additionally you also want privacy of what your interactions are. I understand. Yeah. This kind of gets into a bit more philosophical side of things, but how do you kind of think about censorship in general, and if there should be a balance and safety around this? Is it your stance that it's just a binary kind of thing here, which is we're not going to add anything, and whatever the model says, you kind of proxy to the user as is? Or do you feel like there are definitely some scenarios where this may be relevant, and there should be the ability to do something, and whether it's true now versus could be true later? Like, how does that thinking evolve over time, or do you think there's a framework that you have on how to handle this thing moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, philosophically, one of my deeply held principles is that if there isn't a victim, then there isn't a crime. And this is like a really good framework through which to see the world. And so from the perspective of speech itself never has a victim. If two people are talking voluntarily with each other, it does not matter what they say. There is no victim in that conversation, period. They can talk about anything they want, as horrific or insidious or dangerous as that speech might be. There is no victim from the words. There can be victims from actions taken from words. And then sometimes it is very fair and reasonable to prohibit those actions, which create victims. But the speech itself should be free purely on philosophical grounds because there is no victim to it. So that's obviously woven into our ethos at Venice.
Just to poke that a little bit, I do have other questions I want to get to, but this is now just a really interesting point. How does that definition evolve when, in this case, speech translates to a request to an action, right? I can say, hey, tell me how do I do X, which could be a set of instructions that could be used to harm somebody. And in that case, is that a free speech case, or is that a victim?
There's still no victim there. If I ask the thing like, how do I murder someone? No victim has been created. And I might want to know that for all sorts of reasons, some of them very benign. Maybe I'm writing a book and I want to learn like how that's done so I can make my novel a little more effective. Maybe I'm just like intellectually curious in the topic and I want to explore things. Like the one of the signs of an intelligent and well-formed mind is to be able to explore ideas without automatically accepting or believing them. So what that means is to be able to like explore ideas that you think are wrong or that you don't have an opinion about, and not necessarily thinking that that's true or that you should do it. But again, the most important point here is that any conversation that you have does not create a victim, and so no crime. Like that should be tolerated. Yeah.
Okay, no, that's a good way to frame that. I was looking at it from the perspective of how you kind of back apply this thing. So in this case of, okay, I asked instructions for a murder, but then somebody commits a murder, does that get traced back and looked into a postmortem? Or are we stopping at the interaction as it was happening live, which is free speech and conversation?
Yeah, it's an extremely dangerous slope once you leave the actual action, right? So someone who murders someone, that action is obviously wrong and should be criminal.
Yeah.
But all sorts of tools might be used in that murder. Maybe the AI was used to instruct how it could be done. But what about the car that was used to drive to where the victim lived, right? Or the knife that was used to kill the person? Like, someone manufactured the steel that went into that knife. Someone manufactured the knife. Someone manufactured a computer through which this person learned about how to do the horrible act,
So it's
right?
like funnels all the way down. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like all of these are contributing factors, and none of them are crimes themselves. The crime is very clearly the act of the murder. And frankly, I think if authorities would focus more on the acts which are crimes, they might do a better job of actually reducing crime in society instead of policing all these sort of a priori actions that may or may not lead to one.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. I think we'll shift back to the crypto side of things, and the question I have is, would love to kind of understand how do you make this a lot more accessible, and then you kind of have a really interesting hybrid token model. We'd love to learn about that model, and sort of how are you kind of bringing the decentralized world into the equation here?
Yeah. So my background, of course, is like crypto, and I've lived and breathed it since Bitcoin in 2011. And when I started building Venice, that was a little strange for me because, like, at its core, it's not a crypto product. But I wanted to bring in the principles of decentralization where they made sense and not bring them in where they didn't. So, Venice is a normal centralized company. We operate very much like any kind of SaaS business where people pay for a subscription. But where the decentralization was important for us is in the provisioning of GPUs. So essentially, like most companies would just sign up with a bunch of servers at AWS or similar. And what we wanted to do was build this to be much more resilient in case policy changes in the world. Like, we're trying to build Venice to be, which means that it has to be able to route around all sorts of different types of friction and restrictions. And so that meant that we needed to not build it with the assumption of any particular GPU provider. We needed to build it such that we could use a decentralized set of GPUs. So that's one area in which we've done that. And then also, crypto, of course, is great for payments. So like, it works really well for that. So you can pay for Venice from anywhere in the world using crypto, and we don't have to deal with like, oh, does your credit card work in Nigeria kind of thing. Like, anyone with crypto can pay, and that side of the decentralization works great too. And then we just recently released our token a little over a week ago, and that permits anyone to access the API without paying per request for the API. And in this case, that was a good use of a decentralized asset as well, because that API is geared toward AI agents who are, incorporeal actors. They don't have a credit card or an ID. They need to be able to access an API, and especially for like agents, crypto makes a hell of a lot of sense. So we've tried to bring these things like in where they make sense, but we're not decentralizing elements of our stack that don't need to be.
No, and that's obviously the sensible way to do it. And I think you have the benefit of hindsight and just zooming out version of what we've seen so far happen, and just improving from what we've seen. It's not been a lot of time, but has there been kind of interesting uses for the API that you've seen so far on the platform, and or kind of there are some interesting projects that you can kind of talk about that are leveraging Venice?
Yeah. So yeah, the API is fairly new, and we're just starting to see, and like after the token launch, we're just starting to see people start to play around with this thing. But one of the cool things is that we have a concept in Venice called characters, and anyone who's used character AI is familiar with that. But we made the characters function available through the API. So what that means is that people can build character-based applications with our infrastructure very easily over the API. And it's been fun to watch all the different requests that come in about like different types of interactions that people want with these characters over the API that we hadn't thought of, like creating special API keys that like have a countdown timer on them, or characters that are available on a certain key but not on another key. So lots of like kind of nuanced stuff of people building on the API, but
that's just a natural part of like exploring how you actually
it's also humbling too, because you always think you know how something will be used.
It's never that.
It's often different, and you got to really watch what people actually do instead of what you think they'll do. Good lesson for anyone in business.
Does it make it harder if you don't have a good feedback system built in because you're not learning from usage data?
Yes, and actually this was kind of a struggle in Venice's early days. So Venice launched in May of last year, but the token just launched a week ago. And with that, we created a Discord to like start building that community. And other than the occasional like customer service emails, which were useful, we didn't have this kind of real-time interaction with our hundreds of thousands of users before. And so now it's just like drinking from a fire hose, and they're all in there talking about things. And like many of the ideas aren't great, or we wouldn't do, but then there are some real nuggets in there. And so we're all as a company just trying to adapt to like now being able to talk in real time with all of our users.
That's awesome. I want to close it off by a final question, which is obviously a year of kind of giving people this amazing choice, a week of kind of the API and the token that we're launching. Anything that you can kind of talk about on what we can look forward to for the rest of the year in terms of improvements, things that you want to tackle, or just the choice that people will have, and we can kind of end off in that note.
We're just trying to roll out features as quickly as we can. There's like so many cool things to build with AI now. It's really like an open territory, and there's so much stuff. So we're definitely moving our characters to be more like agents. So that's like a very natural path. Our characters right now are just sort of personalities shaped by the system prompts that you can interact with. And they're fun and they're compelling, but they're not yet agents. And is
the definition of an agent here that they have a notion of memory, or just the ability to chain multiple actions?
Either, and really, I think the thing that makes an agent most agentic, to use that fancy term, when it can do something somewhat autonomously. Like a chatbot, it's always sitting there, and when you ask it something, it responds. But an agent should have some degree of, deciding to take an action and doing it without an input having come in to immediately spur it. And yes, it needs some degree of memory. It needs to be able to interact with the web and with different tools. But it's that sort of like impetus toward behavior that I think makes something agentic.
That's a good definition. I like that. Awesome. Well, Erik, I want to thank you so much for giving us your time and sharing about everything that's been going on in Venice. And can't wait for a lot of people to build on top of the API and just use a way more uncensored LLM.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for having me on. Good chat.